Hey, ladies and gentlemen. It is Friday, January 7th. This is my last day in COVID jail. I should be back in class on Monday. I had hoped that it was going to happen sooner than this, but um, it didn't. So, in any case, we'll pick things up back as normal on Monday, obviously, and we'll go from there. What I want to do today, you guys, I want you guys to go ahead and pull out, and feel free to pause me while you do this. Pull out the timeline from Monday of this week, okay? And the last section in that timeline should be Napoleon Bonaparte's empire, beginning there on page 357. And so I want to spend a little bit of time kind of going through that. I'm not going to go into excruciating detail because, as you guys know, this is not AP European history, but Napoleon does matter. Okay, he does matter, and not just in Europe, but outside of Europe as well. And so we'll see that part. Excuse me, more on Monday. But we want to see sort of why he mattered to Europe as a whole, and not just France today. So as I go through this, you guys, make sure that you add anything to your notes that you might be missing. Okay, like I said, pause me and or back me up and go and make sure you've got this stuff in your guys' notes. It'll show up a couple of different times over the next few weeks, and you basically just have to take my word for it on that. Okay, so by this point, you guys, France has gone through a few major wild spasms. We've got the revolution beginning in the 1780s, 1789, and then we've got the murder of the king and queen in 1793, 1794. We've got the Reign of Terror, all those radical reforms of where people would treat each other 100% equally, or at least all men would. Even women gained the right to own property and to divorce and to inherit property. We talked about the calendar resetting to the year zero, how the Catholic Church lost almost all of its land and buildings and power in France. This is a real, genuine revolution in a lot of ways. And so, by the end of 1794, Robespierre is murdered, okay, by the Committee of Public Safety. We talked about this already. It's like, you guys have heard the expression, live by the sword, die by the sword. He died by the sword. And so then you had a period of about 5 or 6 years or so where France was kind of in limbo, all right? It was controlled by this group of wealthy property owners who were kind of trying to balance the goals of the revolution with the old system, with the estate system. Long story short, you guys, most people wound up pretty grumpy, okay, with this half decade period or so. That's all going to change in 1801. Okay, 1801, we get the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. And, the thing about Napoleon, and everybody calls him Napoleon, it's his first name, it seems weird that we just call him by his first name. Every other historical figure, we refer to them by their last name for the most part. Napoleon, we call him by his first name, but whatever. So Napoleon is a general in the French army as the revolution is taking place. And Napoleon proved himself to be like a really brilliant military tactician. The guy really had a head for war making, I guess you could say. Real smart guy. And so he rose through the ranks of the French army quickly during the years of the revolution. And by 1801, he kind of saw that he could probably do the most good for his country if he went back to France. He had been fighting in Egypt at that point. He'd been fighting the British in Egypt. You guys remember the Great War for Empire, the 7 Years' War. This is kind of like the leftovers of that. And so, in any case, 1801, Napoleon and a small group of his most trusted officers arrive in Paris, and in a bloodless coup d'état, wind up overthrowing the Directory, wind up overthrowing that group of officials. And don't worry about getting the Directory into your notes. Just know that 1801, Napoleon basically puts himself in power, okay, puts himself in charge. And he sees that he's got a lot of work to do. Okay, he's got a lot of work to do. he's got to put France back together again. At least he believes he needs to do that. Well, you guys remember that, I just mentioned it a few minutes ago. One of the biggest sort of conflicts within France was between the Catholic Church and the revolutionaries, and the church had lost everything. So what Napoleon basically does is he tries to come to a bit of a compromise with the Catholic Church. And I'm going to give you guys a couple of examples here of a couple of specifics, of that compromise. I'm going to go quickly, so pause me as you as you guys write this stuff in your notes. So one part of the compromise is that the French government would keep all church property. Okay, the French government would keep all church property and would pay the salaries of all church officials, priests, nuns, monks, bishops, you name it. Okay, so the French government would take on that burden, that financial burden. In return, what the French got was religious freedom. Catholicism, or the Roman Catholic Church, would be I'm air quoting here, the quote unquote preferred faith. Okay, the Napoleon basically declared that that the Roman Catholic Church would be sort of unofficially a Catholic country, but he would also allow for religious freedom for Protestants. Remember, Protestants are Christians who are not Catholic. Okay, religious freedom for Protestants and Jews. Okay, French Protestants and French Jews. So, which is something that was, almost impossible in France before the revolution itself. That's one of the major changes he makes. Okay. Next thing he launches into is revising the constitution for the country. Okay. The highest laws throughout the country come to be known as the Civil Code or the Napoleon Code. Okay. Either term should be just fine. Now, in a lot of ways, this was pretty revolutionary. Okay. Because what the Napoleon Code did was it declared that all adult men, okay, regardless of wealth, all adult men had legal equality. Okay, meaning that they would get the same rights in court, they would get the same government rights. This would apply, like I said, to all men, rich, middle class, or poor. It didn't matter. Okay. Second major thing is that it created a government employment system. Okay, a government employment system where people got their jobs based on their qualifications. Okay, based on their merits, not based on who they know. To us, this is nothing new. The Chinese have been doing this for centuries. Okay, but now finally we get France getting on board with this idea that, maybe we want people qualified for the jobs that they actually have if they're working for the government. Okay, that's us also part of the Napoleonic Code. Now there's a downside, and you can see just by looking at the slide, is that all of those rights that women had won, okay, during the second part of the revolution, most of those rights were now gone. Okay, women did not have the same legal equality as men. They didn't have the same rights. They lost the right, for example, to divorce their husbands. They basically became property again. Napoleon was very old school in that regard. Okay, and I mean, maybe old school isn't the right way of putting it, but Napoleon was super conservative in that regard. He, by our standards, we basically consider him like, a patriarchal chauvinist. Okay, by our standards. But like I said, he wrote the Constitution. And this is the way it was going to be. The second major thing we start to see is because Napoleon is a dictator and eventually becomes an emperor, what we also see is people's civil liberties, their basic freedoms start to erode, I guess you could say. Okay, first, for example, there were restrictions on speech. Okay, on public speech. The government began to censor, CENSOR, began to censor newspapers, right? Like any dictator, I don't care if you're talking about Vladimir Putin or Adolf Hitler or Napoleon Bonaparte, one thing that they all share in common, including pretty much every other dictator in human history, is they like to control information. Okay, they like to control what kind of information the citizens have or get, and so that also becomes embedded in the civil code. On top of everything else, political opponents, okay, also known as dissidents, okay, political opponents of Napoleon were arrested by the thousands, okay, and in some cases not even put on trial and were thrown in prison, and in some cases executed. he does become a full-on dictator, and eventually he declares himself emperor. You don't really need to worry about that. But it's kind of a good news, bad news situation. I know I've used that expression with you guys in the past. That in some ways, France takes some major steps forward in terms of the rights of ordinary French citizens. But there are also some serious steps backward, and you guys can see that right there. Now, some of these Napoleonic reforms, some of these changes, just like we talked about a few days ago, these were a serious threat to other kings and queens around Europe. Okay, this whole idea that like all men have legal equality and getting rid of formal social classes, that was an idea that was pretty scary to a lot of European monarchs because they still had those hard social classes in their own countries. Long story short, France goes to war with Europe. And sometimes they're called the Napoleonic Wars because Napoleon was in charge of France at that time. It doesn't really matter how you refer to them, but basically what we see is France at war with most of its neighbors between 1800 and 1812. Napoleon, there are two different ways of thinking about this. Napoleon, on the one hand, is trying to spread these new revolutionary ideas, okay, for example, of legal equality and religious freedom and religious toleration. He is trying to spread those to other European countries. Well, the reality is most other European countries do not want those changes, okay? And so they're fighting them off. And at the same time, they also don't want to be ruled by France. They don't want to be ruled by a foreign power. And so you wind up with this series of wars, small wars between France and Austria, and France and Spain, and France and Portugal, and France and Italy, and France and Russia. And in the early years, the French under Napoleon Bonaparte is absolutely on a roll. Okay, I mean it's literally like one victory after another. It almost seems like Napoleon can't make any mistakes until 1812. All right, that year is important. 1812, Napoleon decides, what would be awesome if I brought these values, these new revolutionary ideas, to the biggest country on planet Earth. And in 1812, France invades Russia. And this is the big mistake, okay, or Napoleon's biggest mistake, I guess you could say, when we're talking about, military history. He invades Russia. The French soldiers are totally unprepared for the cold, okay, for the weather in Russia. They're unprepared for the Russian resistance. Right? I don't want you guys to think that France just lost because it got a little bit chilly. Okay, France also lost because the Russian people resisted in a big, big way, and we'll talk more about this on Monday in class. Okay, I don't want to elaborate on it too much, but long story short, you guys, and I do believe there is actually a map, and well, you know what? I'll have to find the map for you guys on Monday. But long story short, France invades in 1812. They make about 300 miles worth of progress into Russia, and then they make a U-turn and head back out the same way they came in. Napoleon Bonaparte lost about 90 to 95% of his army. Okay, they either froze to death, or they died in the fighting, or they died of starvation, or they were captured. All right, but like I said, army is utterly destroyed by this invasion of Russia. And this would be the beginning of the end for Napoleon. After the disaster in Russia, or after the Russian victory, depending on how you look at it, Napoleon would have like one defeat after another. And by 1815, and don't really worry about the year, okay, but by 1815, Napoleon has his final defeat. It's a pretty famous battle in European history. It's known as the Battle of Waterloo. The Swedish supergroup ABBA sang an entire song about it. If those of you guys who are unaware of that, and so by 1815, you guys, it's all over with. Okay, it's all over with. Now, I want to end here, you guys. Just a couple of things here. So, why does Napoleon matter? Okay, he creates this huge European empire, but it's kind of like a Mongol-style flash in the pan, right? Why do we care about Napoleon? What are the big picture sort of consequences? This I would also include in your guys' notes. Number one, Okay, Napoleon's invasion or conquest of most of Europe abolished serfdom. Okay, they abolished serfdom. Remember serfdom, SERFDOM as in Michael, serfdom. Okay, number 2, it established legal equality for all men across Europe. And lastly, it helped European countries to create modern bureaucracies. Okay, modern bureaucracies. BUREAUCRACIES. Modern day bureaucracies. Like I said before, just the same as what the Chinese had been doing for centuries. Napoleon and the French all of a sudden got on board with this, and eventually that idea caught on throughout the rest of Europe. So in some ways, Napoleon actually brought Europe into the modern age. Okay, brought it into the modern age. Now we're not just talking about ideas like John Locke and Voltaire, but now we're actually seeing it, those modern ideas being used in government. All right. Okay, so that is going to do it for these notes here, you guys. Like I said, go back and make sure you guys include everything that I mentioned here in these notes in case I went too quickly. From here on out, you guys, you have chapter questions. They're available in Canvas. You should be able to see them right there. And they are due next Friday, just like they always are. All right, you guys have an awesome weekend. I will see you guys on Monday Fun Day. Bye.